Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making it to today's research webinar. So our speaker today is Sai Amulya, who will be giving a talk on whisper networks and workarounds in the context of, I think, urban companies interface. Amulya is an assistant professor in the communications area at IIMA Ahmedabad, and her broad research areas are in feminist media studies, future of work and future of workers, and digital cultures. So the plan is, the schedule is a 1 hour talk, about 30 minutes of presentation that Sai Amulya will be taking us through, and then we'll open up for Q&A for the rest 30 minutes or so. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box as and when you get questions, so that you don't forget some of the queries that you got earlier. And then Sai Amulya can take it towards the take those questions towards the end of the session. Also, the session is being recorded as part of RNP's norm, so please keep your phone on silent. That would not distract you and the speaker as well. The floor is all yours, Sai Amulya.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that succinct introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Allow me to begin with a presentation, so we have time left for a robust Q&A session. The title of the presentation, as Maya has already mentioned and displayed on the screen as well, is Whisper Networks and Workarounds, Negotiating Urban Companies Interface. By drawing on the difficulties service providers face on account of the entrenched culture of servitude that is characteristic of home-based, platformized care work, I shift attention to the often neglected issue of the customer service provider relationship. Drawing on interviews with beauty gig workers in Hyderabad, I point to the creation of whisper networks amongst service providers to deal with exploitation by both the platform and the middle class customer. While most academic scholarship treats men as the subject of such networks, this particular chapter that has been published in a book called FemWork uses an intersectional feminist lens to broaden the scope of whisper networks to include class and caste. Whisper networks emerge as a potent tool for women workers to resist and protest against exploitation and abuse by both the platform and the middle class customer. A little bit of a background before I actually get into the presentation. Just picture this: 9 women crammed into an auto, which is a 3-wheeler vehicle in India, taking a savari, right in Hindi, taking a savari to their workplace. This is how domestic workers in Hyderabad would travel before Corona. The crisis of public transportation and harassment on bus rides meant that domestic workers negotiated with auto drivers to ferry them to their workplace and back home. These shared auto rides provided opportunities for these groups to discuss a variety of issues related to work, trade ideas, brainstorm solutions as a mini collective. En route to the workplace, which is roughly about a 15 to 30-minute ride depending on the traffic, these domestic workers would discuss how much each of them earned to fix the going rate for their labor in a particular area. It is only reasonable, they argued, that people living in posh areas, perceived to be a mix of commercial and residential, pay more than those in purely residential areas, often categorized as low-income neighborhoods by the workers. They would discuss the added benefits of working for a particular family, what infrastructure they expected to already be there, in a home, for instance, a washing machine or a mop, and how they could negotiate issues of leave, including getting one of their travel companions to substitute for them. It is also during these auto rides that the unspoken rule of not snatching work from a fellow worker became a common understanding. As a group, they also decided that a 3-day paid leave per month was not only reasonable, but if these days were not utilized, off days were not utilized, they could always ask to be paid a bonus. Older and more experienced workers, younger workers said, would warn those new to the trade against working in particular homes during these auto savari rides, whether because of sexual harassment or other kinds of abuse. These findings are from a small project on domestic workers that I conducted in 2018 in Hyderabad. And this project gave me insight into how women mobilize themselves, not always via protests or meetings, not always in large numbers, but through their everyday conversations, micro actions, and on their way to the workplace. This is in line with literature on women worker collectivizations in the global south and in informal economies. And this is the work that informed this present publication and also FemLab project that I am a part of. So quickly to sort of just speak a little bit about what FemLab is. FemLab is a researcher activist organization funded by IDRC, which is International Development Research Center. And this project FemLab was meant to examine experiences of women workers in the informal and unorganized sectors, very broadly speaking. As a team, we at FemLab were interested in the experience of women workers in the informal sectors, along 5 sites, construction, sanitation, artisanal, and platform work of 2 kinds, ride hailing and beauty work. And we were also interested in how these women workers leveraged digital technologies to organize themselves or collectivize themselves. Hence the title of the project, Organizing Digitally, Feminist Approaches to Labor. I led the research on platform workers engaged in beauty work. Now, the steady rise of on-demand home-based K-work platforms, such as Book My Buy and Urban Company, gave rise to jobs or gigs, as they're called, that are marked by newer forms of precarity, work instability, worker isolation, and also information asymmetries about ratings, job matching, blended supervision, amongst other things, that seriously weaken worker collective organization by triggering what can only be described as individual and collective anxiety about the future. However, as recent protest by beauty gig workers associated with urban companies suggests, despite constraints, workers find ways to collectivize and protest. Urban Company is a digital labor platform that matches providers and customers through what you call as leads, right? While the protest in Gurugram happened in 2021 and garnered widespread media attention, not many know about the protests against the company in Hyderabad back in 2020. It is interviews with beauty workers here in Hyderabad that alerted us to these protests and gave us insight into how women workers collectivized against all odds to protest against urban company. Now, why do I say all odds? Because worker isolation is a fact. Worker isolation characterizes platform work. Workers hardly meet each other, except say during training programs conducted by urban company. And even this sort of a workshop technique is employed because beauty work and expertise in it comes only through practice and not because the platform wants workers to know each other as such. Now, very briefly, the theoretical and methodological framework that we used for this study, for this paper, an intersectional feminist approach to the study was most apt given our politics. We were interested in centering women workers' standpoints. We were specifically looking at women workers in home-based, platformized care work. While most scholarship was dominated by Uber and Ola, what we refer to as Uberization of platform economy, basically public work, right? I was interested in home-based care work. The site of such work is the customer's home which has traditionally not been considered as workplace, and care which is generally not thought to be work. The lack of comprehensive laws to empower informal and unorganized workers in general, and platform workers in particular, especially against extra-legal mechanisms by the platform to surveil the worker, exacerbates issues of precarity and exploitation. However, one must refrain from homogenizing groups of people as oppressed and powerless. This is what Mohanty also tells us, that homogenizing people as oppressed doesn't really work, especially because those who occupy positions of power cannot understand how women on the margins, whose view we center, exercise agency. This is why I thought the metaphor of Savari is very interesting. It represents both the literal travel involved and the travel from an individualized experience requiring personalized mechanisms, such as, say, negotiating wages, to that of shared experiences and a collective redressal of issues, however small or informal the effort of collectivization it is. In India, trade unions are arguably the most dominant way of collectivizing, given their strong ties with political parties. But the Savari metaphor effectively broadens how collectivization can be imagined beyond this narrow framework of unionization and really honors women's ways of knowing and sharing, where trade unions are indeed a manifestation of one kind of collectivization. At FemLab, we wondered if it is possible to identify and or energize and enhance informal collectivizations like the auto savari groups, right? That might already be happening across sectors via digital technologies. This also meant a recognition that we had to move beyond the instrumental ICT for development approach that almost always looks at third world populations as recipients of development projects and aid, and not as desirous human beings seeking leisure as much as they seek work. Data collection happened over a course of 2 years, 2020 to 2022. And by the time we started collecting data, lockdowns were announced, and yet workers in Hyderabad had successfully protested against urban company, with demands ranging from emergency funds to quick processing of insurance to rising commission. They mobilized themselves through WhatsApp groups. While snowballing helped with getting in touch with partners who were willing to talk to us, another project that I was a part of on platform economy and funded by Southern Center for Inequality Studies helped me get in touch with one of the lead protesters in Hyderabad. The idea was to build trust and become a part of their WhatsApp groups and scrape data. However, by that time, there were whispers that urban company representatives were infiltrating worker groups. They posed or they claimed to be journalists or researchers to do this. So given the stress that they were already under and the kind of anxiety they had, we did not pursue this method. Instead, I requested if I could take a look at what they were talking about on these WhatsApp groups. So quickly, Urban Company became a case study, and we did interviews with 5 women, one of whom led the protest. Another leader who also spoke with us, she was off the record, which I'll get into in just a bit. Right, so apart from customary stock photos of good morning wishes on these WhatsApp groups, the primary mode of communication on these groups seemed to be voice notes. I'd love to hear from you. Can anyone guess as to why this was so? Why voice messages? And if you have any guesses, please put them in the chat. So only after obtaining oral consent did I hear a few of the texts and resumed interviews with workers with the assurance that they had every right to ask me to delete a particular recording or delete bits of the recording or not record some parts of it at all. One of the lead protesters did make use of the last option. She spoke to me entirely off the record, with my field notes being the only record of the conversation. Anonymity was, of course, offered to everyone, and I shared as much about myself as I could as a researcher, given how much information they were giving me about their lived experiences. So Urban Company became a case study, and interviews with workers associated with them yielded rich data and insights. Briefly looking at the review of literature, just to get an idea as to how workers collectivize in informal sectors. Literature shows that structured trade unionizing works in developing countries and informal sectors. Independent collectives, unions, cooperatives are really the ways in which women workers in informal economy resist and protest. That's how they mobilize themselves. For instance, domestic workers, organizations and unions in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Hong Kong, where you've seen that they've used mobile phones and the internet to create virtual solidarities, mobilize themselves to protest against discriminatory laws, such as the proposed minimum 2-year contract at a placement agency, and also to document abuse. So recent literature also on platform economy shows that this sort of organizing and mobilizing follows into the platform economy. Delivery and ride-hailing workers in China, for instance, used WeChat to game the algorithm, to collectively log off the app to make their voices heard. And this is something that Liu and Reitman also observe and note. So workers associated with Urban Company also used WhatsApp similarly. There are multiple WhatsApp groups, and every beauty worker is part of several groups. Now, why are there several WhatsApp groups? Because there are partners who have met during training sessions and they all form one group. Then there are partners who are part of a hub. Basically, every city is divided into zones, and partners get leads according to the zone that they belong to, right? So partners who are from one zone, they tend to form one WhatsApp group. Then there are partners who were friends even before the platform, and they have a separate WhatsApp group. So there are multiple WhatsApp groups, and they have multiple memberships in that sense. And some of them don't even know each other. On some WhatsApp groups, you'd find that there's a person who doesn't know another worker at all, but they are a part of the group because somebody knows somebody else. So they're all nodes in particular matrix. From our conversation with beauty gig workers, both male and female, in some cases, commissions, new subscription plans, offering discounts without consulting the providers, expansion of hubs, lack of emergency funds in case of accidents or other medical emergencies, difficulties in understanding how ratings could take an overall dip. They would have 4.7 rating and suddenly to take a dip and be 3, and they would not understand why that was the case. So these are the issues that emerged as some of the main challenges that these workers discussed in these WhatsApp groups. When the escalation of these issues to the managerial level in Hyderabad did not lead to any sort of resolution is when workers were forced to protest against the company and lodged a case against urban company at a local police station in Hyderabad. Similar issues were raised during the Gurugram protests as well, which happened in 2021. So what do they discuss in these groups? Apart from, all these challenges, which is to do with, app updates, features that they don't understand, that they are also discussed. Ideally, these issues should have been addressed by the platform. However, automated helplines can only do so much. So partners use these groups as information sharing platform or as a knowledge sharing platform. They also discuss the issue of difficult customers, rules of the platform that they don't understand, and also forward jokes, memes, texts, and good morning, good night messages. Right. So apart from these and the grievances with the platform, a rarely discussed issue in the public discourse, at least, is that of customer attitude and behavior, which was foregrounded by the providers in our interviews, couched in statements like, not all customers are the same. There are very real issues of being treated with no dignity by middle-class customers, such as not being allowed to use the washroom that gain legitimacy from platform standard operating procedures. For instance, a new standard operating procedure was launched by Urban Company during the pandemic, which point to the entrenched culture of servitude that characterizes any sort of care and domestic work in India, and how platform work can exacerbate it. The new SOP followed had providers clean not just the area that they worked in, problematic as it is, and discussed in my previous work, but also included sanitizing any object that workers came into contact with. For instance, tap that they might have used in the bathroom, doorbell or doorknob that they might have touched. At the end of the service, workers would then be given a hygiene rating by customers. And this SOP had to be diligently followed by all service providers in order to obtain the required hygiene rating from customers. So the idea that pros or partners or providers or workers must sanitize whatever they come into contact with, or not being allowed to use washrooms, cannot be untangled from the discourses of caste and polluting bodies in India. As most scholarship on social distancing during the pandemic notes, given the history of sanitization workers in India, the stigma and social ostracization they face on account of dealing with waste, the sanitizing of objects that one comes into contact with, indeed, if they even have the right to touch objects that are not their own, or not being allowed to use washrooms, are inseparable from that of caste. So these conversations on what they could and could not do, could not touch, also led to a discussion on the expectations of customers. An unspoken rule is workers should not use phones while working. Often, this is not really explicitly stated, but providers learn to read customers' body language, their tone, and other behavioral tells to not risk low ratings. A few customers would want them to offer services not booked via the app at a discounted rate because, hey, they don't cut a commission, right? So customers would also book a good number of services for fear of their request not being accepted, then cancel the more expensive ones that would have justified workers' costs of traveling and the commission that is being cut. So middle-class customers could give a low rating for any or no reason at all. Most workers complained about this. And, if in case an emergency phone call is attended by the partner, if they refuse to provide services that have not been booked via the app, or any perceived slight could lead to a dip in the rating. So a few customers also hurl abuses and harass providers. Now, one would obviously ask, can you raise these issues and lodge complaint against these individual customers, lodge complaints against the customers of the platform? Unfortunately, individual complaints against these customers would go unheard by the platform. A one-off incident would not warrant any action. And more often than not, in what is perceived as a one-off incident, the platform would favor the customer because of profit logic. So since the same provider is not assigned to a customer, how would one identify repeat offenders and lodge a complaint against them collectively, right? So here is where WhatsApp group comes to rescue. Any troublesome customer would be reported in these groups. Repeat offenders would be identified by providers so that they could refuse to take booking at the cost of penalty. Mind you, cancellation charges are levied when they cancel a booking after having accepted it. But even then, they would do so just so they would not be harassed by that particular customer, and who's known to harass the provider, right? So, however, when multiple partners refuse to take bookings from a particular ID, platform would be forced into taking action by blocking that particular ID. Now, this does not mean the end to their problems. Customers can always create a new ID. Therefore, partners keep a record of the customer and their location and refuse bookings that come from the said location. These whisper networks are incredibly important for service providers or partners or simply workers to avoid a domino effect on the physical, mental, and financial well-being of the partner. Now, here is where I draw on whisper networks, which is usually thought of as a thriving system of informal communication amongst workers to warn each other about sexual predators. And usually, typically, the subject of these whisper networks tend to be men. As McDermott notes, whisper networks are a function of and not a solution to toxic environments. In the absence of any sort of a legal mechanism to lodge formal complaint, or when these mechanisms fail to hold men accountable, women rely on whisper networks for validation and solidarity. Digital technologies help scale up these issues. Once you launch a movement, or once you raise an issue, they kind of quickly scale up with such speed that they eventually lead to bigger movements, like say the hashtag MeToo movement and hashtag LOSHA. Typically, men are the subjects of these networks in both popular discourse and academic scholarship, even though harassment is defined in broad terms, inclusive of verbal, non-verbal, physical, mental abuse. Rarely is there an attempt to examine experiences of harassment, abuse, and exploitation from the lens of gender, caste, class, and often religion as well, to expand the scope of whisper networks. For instance, the apathy of the middle class woman customer when it comes to providers belonging to marginalized communities and their issues, and the way they're treated in customers' homes cannot be understood in terms of gender alone, but also in terms of caste and class. Historically, the Brahminical discourses of purity and impurity, ritually polluting bodies, dictate the boundaries of what a woman worker from a marginalized class and caste can and cannot touch, and what work she can and she cannot do. It is here that an intersection feminist lens that is sensitive to the dimensions of gender, to class, and class lenses the necessary theoretical tool to widen the scope of whisper networks. Caste and class play an important role in home-based services since such work is characterized by the master-slave relationship. It is here that we get a glimpse of how providers resist exploitation by both the platform and customers. Worker agency can take many forms. They can take the form of protests that are oppositional, but there are also other subtler, covert ways in which it is expressed, such as forming WhatsApp groups, creation of whisper networks, and just as auto rights serve as space for collectivization, WhatsApp groups function as a space where these issues are discussed. But then again, allow me to conclude on this note. It is crucial to note that these WhatsApp groups, much like the Auto Savari groups, are not created for any instrumental purposes such as collectivization. They are created to discuss their personal lives, opportunities for work, forward messages, memes, update each other about policies related to the platform that they're associated with, features launched, and even information about difficult customers, thereby serving as a knowledge sharing platform. But it's not just a knowledge sharing platform. What it means is following the communicative ecologies approach from an intersectional feminist lens means that we necessarily move away from this very utilitarian developmental angle that pays very little attention, or in fact no attention whatsoever, to the leisure-oriented practices of the third world populations. right? Here we acknowledge multiple non-dichotomic identities such that women are human beings, they're friends, they're workers, and members of several communities, part of several WhatsApp groups. And as members of multiple communities with multiple identities, they're positioned variously within power relations. They experience exploitation, but also exercise agency. And it is only through a culture of listening that we understand how these women are exercising agency. The feminist approach views workers, providers as more than their work or more than just service providers. They are people who experience life fully in their complexity. Their WhatsApp groups, therefore, are not meant for the sole purpose of mobilization, but leisure, levity, petty fights, in fact, and of course, to function to for the sole, and also meant to mobilize themselves and function as whisper networks. So this sort of an approach rehumanizes workers, a move that is crucial and critical in economies that are increasingly being platformized and algorithmized. Thank you so much. Maya?
Yeah, thanks, Amulya. We'll now open it up for questions. I think there are some comments in the chat box when you had earlier asked them to kind of comment on your question earlier.
Oh, right. Let me quickly stop sharing. Yeah. Okay. Chat. Let me go to the chat. Okay. Voice notes, easily listening to them while running gigs, especially as workers are often running from one place to another. Voice messages are quicker, easier, yes. Communicating in their native language that you see may or may not understand, provide a greater form of privacy. You can post this. Yeah, it's a combination of all these things. One is these workers are, of course, incredibly busy and they cannot spend time texting, but also the fact that they're not entirely comfortable with texting, right? They do not have that kind of literacy. Good morning, good evening still can be done, but the kind of literacy that is required for them to type and to get sort of familiarized with the local native language keyboard takes time. So it's easier for them to send voice notes, which is also, and again, yeah, the privacy bit as well. You can take screenshots, but voice notes is much difficult to sort of trace it back to you. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we have a question from Aisha. Aisha, please go ahead.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Thanks a lot, Amulya. Hi, thanks. That was very, very insightful. And I'm a PhD student beginning to just do some field work with urban company and food delivery workers in Delhi. So I had a bunch of questions. One, I thought you starting off with the metaphor of the Savari and that powerful imagery. And I've been thinking about some of the interconnections between, you spoke about cultures of servitude, so some of the interconnections between domestic work and home-based service work in terms of all these dimensions, such as the intersections of caste and class, especially when it comes to workers not being able to access basic services like toilet and drinking water. And I'm sort of curious, and this is perhaps not directly related, but I'm sort of curious if in the larger framework of collectivization, there is something in terms of the intersections between, say, the collectivization of home-based service workers and, say, the domestic workers movement. I don't find that happening in Delhi, but I'm curious to know if there are observations around this in other Indian cities, and there could be reasons for why those intersections are not happening. Perhaps urban company workers would want to see themselves differently as service workers and so on. But I'm still curious because the intersections in terms of the cultures of servitude are pretty evident. And I'm also, I mean, you spoke about questions of ratings. And just 2 days ago, there was a public meeting by some of the workers whose IDs have been blocked through one of the trade unions active in the city. And in response, the management comes up with this norm about if your rating falls below so and so, it's an automatic ID block, and there's nothing the app can do unless you fulfill all these other 10 conditions, which is maybe attend a seminar, or sorry, attend a training, which the app itself will tell you. So there really seems to be no logical human interface also happening, because it looks like the app will dictate everything. So again, in terms of the algorithm and how it controls workers' lives, I was curious to learn if you have more insights from your work, because the question of blocked IDs has been coming quite repeatedly in some of my fieldwork, but also, I mean, it's in the news, it's on Twitter feeds, and so on. Just curious to hear your thoughts on these two, and thank you. This was very, very insightful.
Thank you, Isha, for your questions. Maya, should I go ahead and address them and then take the other ones? Yeah. Your first question was if there is perhaps organizing amongst domestic workers and beauty workers. I would think that the way in which our society is, so politically fractured, and our identities are are fractured as well. I would think that there's something to say about how we categorize work, skilled work, semi-skilled work, right? So beauty workers, I suppose, would still consider themselves as workers. They identify as workers, but if you really look at workers who do domestic work, who do border work as such, and who do artisanal work, there is some difficulty in getting to accept themselves as workers, despite the kind of organizing that has happened in Hyderabad, and I know for a fact in Bengal, in other places as well. There's some difficulty in domestic workers accepting themselves as workers, one. Second, there's been a concerted effort by at least some local organizations in Hyderabad, funded by missionaries, who try and bring together these sort of marginalized groups so that their voice is collectively heard. But I don't think they've been very successful in doing that. There's still sort of this organizing happens in silos. Also, the Telangana Gig Workers Union, which has the leaders of which are based out of Telangana, they've also tried to sort of bring together workers from ride hailing, from beauty work, from different sectors. But that's also limited because of the kind of well, at least the discourse on Twitter seems to be about ride hailing, about these public facing works rather than what's happening behind closed doors in a customer's home, right? The second question is about rating and okay, so rating and blocked IDs. In one of my previous works, I do talk about blended cultures, which is really that the kind of surveillance that happens, the kind of control that platforms exert over workers happens in different levels, right? One is, of course, the trainers that supervise them, because they are the ones who oversaw the training. They are answerable to them first. Then they have their category managers that they're accountable to, sorry. So supervision, control, surveillance, these happen at different levels. It's both human, it's also algorithmic, and also by customers, actually. That's also an important dimension. And it keeps coming up, but somehow, at least in terms of urban company, they've been trying to balance in some way the social good or social welfare and the profit logic, but without a wider consultation, with workers and with academics such as ourselves who are working in this area. It would sort of be difficult to come up with a resolution that can address it to the extent to which that we expect organizations to sort of deliver, I suppose. But that's me being hopeful.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's very comprehensive. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Amulya. I think we have another question from Swapnil. Swapnil, you can unmute yourself and please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. Am I audible?
Yes, Swapnil.
It's a very interesting idea, Professor. I was not very aware of these developments. My question is, so you've actually covered the informal mechanisms that exist for worker collectivization, but there also exists some formal mechanisms, such as, for instance, in some multi-system platforms like Zomato and Uber, there exists this mechanism that the for instance, the drivers or the delivery people can actually rate the customers. So do you think something like that actually helps in worker collectivization?
The rating system also exists in urban company, but what comes of it? A lot of workers that I've spoken with say that they do give low rating or whatever, depending on the kind of treatment that they've received from the customer. But the question is, what happens with these ratings? Does something come of it? Is there any action taken by the platform? And it would be interesting to talk to any of these delivery or food delivery or ride hailing providers as well, to ask if their ratings are taken seriously. Because there's one thing about care washing and ethics washing, right? So you might have these mechanisms in place, the platform might have these mechanisms in place, but for care washing purposes, what comes of it is also important. From our research, at least, the workers are at a loss as to how these ratings are compiled and what comes of it. And when they complain in as many words, what is happening with those complaints, that's something that they're not aware of at all. I see a comment, so just to sort of...
I think there's a question by Anshuman on the chat box. I think he says, just as a counterpoint, do you believe that the establishment of workarounds, even as they are very effective, takes away the onus from the aggregator platform to resolve the structural problem within their business model? Would a more formalized collectivization like a labor union lend more legal validity to the problem, thus forcing urban company to act?
This question sort of would force me to go into the way in which laws have operated in India, right from our colonial legacy, where they followed a very extractive sort of a policy, to the expansionist policy that they followed elsewhere, where they did not want to sort of give up their colony, right? So in India, at least, we've had a lot of laws, the teething of which is missing. One. Second, even when there are laws, capitalists can find a loophole, or people who are so motivated can find a loophole, right? So but it doesn't mean that these systemic structural problems do not need structural systemic reforms. They do, but they can't wait. Workers can't wait. This is again connected to the agency of workers that I spoke about. It's very easy to think of workers as victims, as helpless, as victims of their circumstances and just going through their lives, but this sort of research actually tells us that they're negotiating every day, and they're using the tools that are available to them to make something of their lives, and especially when you think of workers as more than workers, as human beings, as women workers, as human beings who have so much more, whose life is so much more than just their work, then you actually see the way in which media is embedded in their lives and what they're doing with it. So the idea behind adopting these different theoretical frameworks was to move away from this whole victim narrative. Having said that, it doesn't mean that there is no value to a labor union, say, or to laws that can govern these platforms. Of course, it's important that we have laws. On the question of labor union, I think women on the left have learned a very hard lesson that way, that because men dominate these unions, women workers or specific issues that emerge or the way in which work is shaped by gender, the way in which there are specific challenges that are specific to women workers, they're not addressed by labor unions. Hence, hence why women sort of have their own mini collectives as such. I'm trying to answer it in as nuanced a way as possible.
I think we have... Yeah, Anshuman, you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you. Thank you, that's all.
Thanks, Amulya. I think we have one more question by Erika.
Hi, Erika.
Hi, I missed your introduction, so I'm kind of unsure how I should address you, as Sai, or I couldn't understand, pardon my ignorance, which is the first name, or are they both first names?
Sai Amulya, yeah.
Sai, okay. So one, thank you so much for your presentation, and I'm part of a reading group that looks at the intersection of various things between tech and society, and in fact our reading for this month is on the future of work and looking at, so it was a very timely kind of publication, the work that came out from the FemLab stuff. So really, thank you so much for that. My question to you was, while I totally appreciate a kind of the lens, the various lenses, actually, I know you say that you're looking at from a feminist lens, but the various intersections, let's put it that way, the various intersections that you talk about, you know, gender, class, caste, that's so kind of specific to the condition in India, and probably similar kind of intersections with tribes in Africa and other global south or developing countries. So I wanted to ask from you that, yes, I see the value in kind of projecting this non-victim point of view or non-victim perspective or image or framing of women workers and how they collectivize, whether in small WhatsApp groups or other kind of tech-enabled collectives. Is your work, are you or your colleagues at FemLab also going to be looking to informing kind of government and public policy through this kind of work, and not just the companies themselves that you're using as case studies? Because while I understand your comment about laws not having teeth, but at the end of the day, we are kind of what the previous question, about systemic changes, that these are great, these are laud-worthy, but what tends to happen with asymmetrical power relations is private sector as well as government kind of wash their hands off and almost glorify these grassroots kind of movement, just the way we glorify Jugaad in India, where it's glorified as this individual agency and individual entrepreneurial spirit, rather than examine kind of the lack of that give rise to these more in spite of, because there's such a lack of both private sector policy and public policy.
Right.
So is your work, are you looking at informing kind of government groups at both state and central ministerial levels as to why they should be looking at these kind of things when they do labor laws and stuff like that?
Right. Thank you so much, Erika, for that detailed question. The first statement that you made, whether it's workers in India, tribes in Africa, or even migrants in developed countries, they sort of face similar issues. So one. Second, not projecting, but rather valorizing. And I state valorizing because I'm acutely aware of the position that I occupy and also acutely aware of the politics of knowledge production. I think we were responding to the future of workers debate and research as researchers from Global South. And there's a tendency that when researchers who are funded by international organizations, typically occupying positions in the Global North or trained with tools of knowing and sharing and understanding in the Global North, they tend to look at third world women and populations. Third world again is problematic, but for lack of a better word, third world populations or populations in the Global South as victims, as helpless victims. But the idea was to sort of take away from that whole instrumental needing development aid kind of an angle to really throwing light on women who are desiring. Now, as a researcher from the Global South, I'm hyper aware that here, when we talk about pleasure, when we talk about desire, it's something that people think women from the third world should not talk about for whatever reasons. So, which is why we valorized this kind of a lens. Right. And also, again, drawing from, because you've mentioned tribes in Africa and because I mentioned migrants in developed countries, let me also state that this work is also sort of in engagement with literature or scholarship from indigenous communities, like for instance, Escobar's pluralist approach, right? So there are plural worlds. So there are ways in which, so this was a very conscious decision to approach this particular research from this sort of an angle, from this sort of a lens. As to your question about, are we looking to also make recommendations towards policy making, we've been, IT for Change, for instance, had this roundtable consultation on the Niti Aayog report, where Niti Aayog representatives were also there, and we made pointed suggestions, and we had other organizations as well who took part in this consultation. I think that's also one of the reasons why when I presented, I sort of used I and we, because again, aware of the fact that this sort of knowledge is not produced in isolation, and I don't own this data, but this has happened in, I wouldn't say collaboration, but because it came from the voices of the people. Hopefully what are outcomes from this research, apart from academic publications, is one, to sort of make the policy recommendations and also design recommendations. And we've also been working with Justice Adda to make sure that workers find these contracts accessible. If you look at the terms and conditions of, say, UC or any platform, it's very difficult to understand what it is saying. So we've been working with Justice Adda to sort of translate them into accessible work contracts. So that work is still sort of pending, but we've been engaging with other organizations and also speaking to and yeah, look forward to policy and design recommendations as well, platform design recommendations.
Thank you so much, Sai. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika, for your question.
I think we have a question from Shruti.
Hello, Professor.
Shruti, you're not audible.
Am I not audible?
It's very feeble. Your voice is very feeble.
Okay. Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I'm just curious to know, since workers do understand the impact of algorithms on their earnings or possibly the continuity on their platforms, were they able to devise any strategies to bypass the algorithms? For instance, if they anticipate that the post-service experience has not been good and the customer could give them a bad rating, would they communicate to the customer saying that they should, if they could refrain from giving them a bad rating, or any other strategies that they could have adopted to bypass the algorithms? Just curious to know.
From my conversations, at least, I'll have to sort of again think back to my conversations if they've spoken about gaming the system. In terms of not booking, I guess, in terms of not booking certain leads, that's one way to game the system. But your second point was about, I'm sorry, what was the second point about? Oh yeah, about asking customers to give them a certain rating. I would say that they're not entirely happy with that sort of a technique, because it would mean asking, not just asking, but requesting the customer, can you please give me a particular rating? And this you see with delivery workers as well. And this plays right into the hands of the customer, the kind of power. And this is designed to be that way. It's not even as if, but it is designed to be that way, where service providers have to request the customer to give them a certain rating. But I can see, I mean, it's a problematic thing. That wouldn't be gaming the system, but rather giving into the system. Gaming, I would feel like collectively rejecting a particular booking, or collectively coming up with a mechanism where, for instance, I know this happened in China, the research work that I cited, where drivers understood the hotspots where they would receive a lot of rides, a lot of booking for rides. They would go and sort of, hang out in that particular area, or avoid a certain area because they know that they would not get bookings from there. So that sort of gaming the system exists. I don't think I have gaming the system, let's see, perhaps circumventing the platform as a whole, and having this personal relationship with customers, so that they can circumvent the app in totality and provide it as an individual expert beautician or an esthetician. That happens, but we've also seen that Urban Company has been trying to sort of get around that by making sure that there are no repeat customers. Earlier, a repeat customer would mean higher commission, or a higher amount that the beautician could get. But of late, they've been refraining from giving repeat customers so that this sort of circumventing the app doesn't happen. Which is why really I feel like the app is not this, this final product, but this app is being made and unmade. And this happens through the dynamics that exist in the material world.
Thank you.
Professor, if I could just pitch in a little bit.
Yes, please go ahead.
Regarding Shruti's question, I've unfortunately never had the opportunity to actually engage with any female workers, either through an urban company or any other multi-sided platform. But with men, I think I've had a lot of experience because AC fixing or any kind of plumbering, or so generally men are the dominant gender in these kinds of roles. So I believe that they do have a strategy that they apply to get better ratings, and I think that is introducing an element of informality. So I don't know if you could explore this in women as well, but I think this is difficult for women because of maybe if there's maybe if the house belongs to a man and they are going to a man's house, then it's obviously very difficult for women to engage in any kind of informality. But with men, so as in if I am a man and there's a man who's working for me, I believe that what they do is that so a lot of people generally have this very informal air about them, but a lot of people, what they do is that in the end, towards the end, we engage in a lot of informal conversation, casual conversation, and in the end, they're just like, instead of requesting, they just say, ki, sir, acha rating de dena. If you get my gist. So I don't know if this is a strategy, but or if it's just the air of people, but a lot of people just do this instead of requesting specifically for a good review.
And this is actually a very interesting point, because if you read through scholarship on domestic work, there's this wonderful book called Domestic Days by Samita Sen, I think, who talks about strategic intimacy, where domestic workers establish this kind of informality, almost familial kind of an intimacy with customers, so that they can keep benefits flowing, whether it's extra cash for marriage or holidays. But that's a whole different scenario that is possible. But here you have your platform that's sort of mediating all of this, and also that you're being rated according to a particular gig. So it would actually be giving into the power of the platform and power of the customer. There should be better mechanisms than this, rather than having customers, rather than having service providers request for a better rating. There must be a better mechanism, but yeah.
Hello, Professor. I had just one observation.
Suraj.
Yes. With regards to the beauty workers from urban company, I have personally encountered this a few times. So when we book the services from a beautician, and if it's a new person who is coming, she'll do the service. And after that, so she herself upfront states that, okay, she asked this question first, ma'am, how did you like the service? And the moment you say that, yes, you liked it and that she was good, she says, in future, if you need any other services, you can just contact me directly on my phone number. And she offers a very lucrative pricing, the price point, because, and then when we ask, how is it that you're offering such a low price? It's almost like 20-30% lower, and plus the taxes and all of that's taken care of. So then she says, because we do not have to pay any commission on this, so it's our personal thing. So it's our personal income. So that's one way of circumventing the platform altogether. And what they also additionally do is, just in case you have other people in your network who would also want to take the service, because when I was at the campus, and so we used to plan, some of our friends, we would plan up the, service on the same day. We would call the same person, and we would plan this so that, the same lady comes and she does the job for everybody on the same day. And then, so it was a win-win proposition for all of us. Similarly, for AC cleaning also, we've had this experience again on campus again from urban company guys. So first time we called them in the first year, that was through the app. And after that, ever since then, we have called that person separately without the app. And it's always has been a bunch of like 5, 6, 7 people who've gotten the AC serviced at much lower costs. So that's how it happens. The part about circumventing the platform.
Right, Suruj. Thank you so much. I mean, that's true, because one of the lead protesters who spoke with me off the record also says that It also depends on the customer. If they feel that the customer has treated them with some modicum of dignity, they are ready to sort of do this. But there are also service providers who do not like circumventing the app because one, customers will ask for discounts, and second, the sort of respect that they gain from being associated, just wearing the uniform. So yeah, there are sort of mixed and I think the idea, if you're a researcher, then you're thinking about both the challenges and the opportunities. And like Erica mentioned, if you're making a policy recommendation, then how best can you take both of these viewpoints and then suggest something that does not take away from what they see as a benefit or as a gain or as a good trade-off, and something that can exacerbate issues of precarity. And yes, yeah, it's true that there's recent literature emerging on this intermediation. It focuses on aggregate. This is also happening because because I'm dealing with research on urban company. If you read interviews by the founders, then you'll see that they are actually responding to this kind of circumventing of the app, and they've been trying to come up with a workaround around this. How do you make sure that platform workers stick with the platform, do not leave the platform? But like gig work, they are associated with multiple platforms and also take up gigs, as Suruchi has already mentioned. Thank you, Suruchi, for those insights.
Yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sai Amulya, for taking time out to present your work on a, very interesting topic. And thank you everyone for your enthusiastic participation. So have a good evening, rest of the.
Thank you, everyone. Good day.